All right, this short video, we're just going to take a quick look at what might have happened to Barnabas and Paul's relationship after Acts chapter 15. In the end of Acts chapter 15, we read that they part ways, having a sharp disagreement over whether or not they should take John Mark with them when they were returning in their missionary journey. And the book of Acts says nothing more about Barnabas. Barnabas is no longer mentioned in Acts. Of course, much is written about Paul. However, it records Paul's journey in chapter 16, just immediately after. It says he took with him Silas, and then he picks up Timothy here in chapter 16 as well, the early verses, verse 1 through 3. And then he goes on to Philippi in chapter 16. In chapter 17, he goes to Thessalonica, and then Berea, and then Athens. But then significantly in chapter 18, he comes to Corinth. So Paul, on his missionary journey, goes to Corinth. This is the first time he's come to Corinth. He's never been there before. And then he does labor in Corinth. He stays there for a significant period of time. It actually says in verse 11, so Paul stayed for a year and a half in Corinth, teaching them the word of God. Then even after that, in verse 18, it says Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers. So after a year and a half, you have the events of verses 12 through 17. But then even after that, there's verse 18, which saying he continued on for some time after that. So for a significant time, at least a year and a half, likely I think over 2 years, Paul is in Corinth doing the work. Now remember, he had taken Silas and Timothy with him on this missionary journey. And Silas and Timothy in verse 5 of chapter 18, actually they come from Macedonia to be with him in Corinth. And so they're also there with him in Corinth, and they're laboring. Then also we have in chapter 18, we're introduced to a man named Apollos. In verse 24, meanwhile a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. But then from there, this same Apollos travels, verse 27, he goes to Achaia. And then in chapter 19, verse 1, Apollos was at Corinth. All right, so hopefully you followed all of that. Paul comes to Corinth. He labors there for 2 years. Sometime after that, we have a guy named Christian. He becomes a Christian, Apollos, who also labors in Corinth after that. All right, but again, Paul begins the work. In the words of Paul, which we're going to go into 1 Corinthians, the letter to Corinthians, in the words of Paul, he says that I planted and Apollos watered. But again, what does this have to do with Barnabas? I'm sure you're wondering now. Well, follow me here. Paul, after Corinth, he goes to Ephesus, and we believe it's pretty plain from the evidence that in Ephesus is where Paul writes a letter to the Corinthians, and that's, you can look in in chapter 19 of Acts as well as 1 Corinthians 16, and comparing those passages, you can find the evidence for understanding that it's from Ephesus, just after he, shortly after I should say, he left from Corinth, that he writes 1 Corinthians. So 1 Corinthians is written after Paul has been to Corinth, and after he's begun the church there. Then Apollos continues it. But now in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, there's some very interesting material here. We have here Paul defending the fact that he's an apostle. And he says in verse 3, this is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? I hope you're reading at this, because you're probably already ahead of me if you are. But notice he says we. Don't we, verse 4. Don't we, verse 5. Who is this we, Paul? Who is the we that you're talking about? Verse 6. Or is it only I and Barnabas who must work for a living? He's writing to Corinthians here, and he's talking about we, and then he lists the we. The we are, verse 6, is it only I and Barnabas who must work for a living? Okay, that's interesting. So the we in this context refers to Paul and Barnabas. we'll skip down, but we're still within this context here. What are we saying, Paul, about you and Barnabas? In verse 11, if we, there's nothing to suggest any other we here, if we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? The same we. If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? As I mentioned, the we here seems to point directly to Paul and Barnabas, and Paul is saying that we, Paul and Barnabas, sowed spiritual seed among you. We're writing to the Corinthians, you, the people of Corinth. Again, as we looked at before, Paul is writing 1 Corinthians from Ephesus, and it's not too much longer after chapter 18 where he first visits and raises up the church in Corinth. He plants, and Apollos shortly after waters. So this suggests, I think very strongly, that though Luke doesn't record it in Acts, that at some point in the time period of Acts chapter 18, Barnabas, who had separated from Paul in the end of Acts chapter 15, had gone with John Mark to Cyprus. Barnabas comes to Corinth and works again with Paul. And I think that's a very important point. Again, I will acknowledge it's not explicitly stated, and we are kind of putting some passages together, but I think it's pretty strongly supported by that passage in 1 Corinthians. If this is the case, it shows a very strong and even early reconciliation of the rift they had, because this is the same trip in Acts chapter 18 that Paul had gone on when he separated from Barnabas. So it seems that if this is the case, then they would have separated and on the same trip come back together again and done work, and they together sowed the spiritual seed in Corinth. Just want to make that little point. Hopefully it's helpful to you.